The Life of Numa by Plutarch, translated by Aubrey Stewart. There is a considerable conflict of opinion about the time of King Numa's reign, although several pedigrees seem to be accurately traced to him. One Clodius, in a book on the verification of dates, insists that all these old records were destroyed during the Gaulish troubles, and that those which are now extant were composed by interested persons, by whose means men who had no right to such honors claimed descent from the noblest families. Though Numa is said to have been a friend of Pythagoras, yet some deny that he had any tincture of Greek learning, arguing that either he was born with a natural capacity for sound learning, or that he was taught by some barbarian. Others say that Pythagoras was born much later, some 5 generations after the times of Numa, but that Pythagoras the Spartan, who won the stadium race at Olympia on the 13th Olympiad, wandered into Italy and there meeting Numa, assisted him in the establishment of his constitution, and that from this cause the Roman constitution in many points resembles the Laconian. The Olympic Games were instituted in the 3rd year of Numa's reign. Another story is that Numa was a Sabine by birth, and the Sabines consider themselves to be of Lacedaemonian origin. It is hard to reconcile the dates, especially those which refer to Olympiads, the table of which is said to have been made out by Hippias of Elis, on no trustworthy basis. However, what things I have heard about Numa that are worthy of mention, I shall proceed to relate, beginning from a starting point of my own. Rome had been founded, and Romulus had reigned, for 37 years, when upon the 5th day of the month of July, which day is now called None Capitine, he was performing a public sacrifice outside the gates, at a place called the Goat's Marsh, in the presence of the Senate and most of the people. Suddenly a great commotion began in the air. Thick clouds covered the earth, with violent gusts and showers. The people fled in terror, and Romulus disappeared. His body could never be found, but suspicion fell upon the patricians, and a report was current among the populace that they had long been jealous of his power as king, and had determined to get it into their own hands. Indeed, he had dealt with them very harshly and tyrannically. Fearing this suspicion, he gave out that he was not dead, but had been caught up into heaven, and Proclus, a man of mark, swore that he saw Romulus ascend into heaven in his armor as he was, and that he had heard a voice ordering that he should be called Quirinius. Another disturbance took place in Rome about the election of the next king, because the new citizens were not yet thoroughly amalgamated with the old ones. The people were unquiet, and the patricians suspicious of one another. Nevertheless, they all determined that they would have a king, but they disagreed not merely about who, but what race he should be of. Romulus's original colonists thought it was a monstrous thing that the Sabines, because they had been admitted to share of the city and the country, should propose to rule over it, while the Sabines, not unreasonably, urged that because, after the death of Tatius, they had acquiesced in Romulus reigning alone, now in their turn they ought to furnish a king of their own nation. They had not, they said, been adopted by a more powerful race than themselves, but had by their combination with the Romans greatly raised the power and renown of their city. The two races were at issue on these points. The patricians, fearing that confusion might arise if the state were left without a head, made one of their own number every day assume the insignia of royalty, perform the usual sacrifices to the gods, and transact business for 6 hours by day and 6 by night. This equal division of their periods of rule was not only just for those in office, but prevented any jealousy of them being felt by the populace each day and night, because they saw one who had been a king become a private person. This form of government the Romans call an interregnum. But although they appeared to manage things so smoothly, suspicions and threatenings of disturbance arose, for men said that they meditated altering the form of government to an oligarchy in order to keep all political power in their own hands, and would not therefore elect a king. Hereupon the two factions agreed that one should select a king from the ranks of the other. This, they thought, would both put an end to their quarrels for the present, and also ensure the candidate who should be chosen among being impartial, because he would be friendly to the one party because it had chosen him, and to the other because he belonged to it by birth. The Sabines gave the Romans their choice which they would do, and they decided that it would be better to choose a Sabine king themselves than to be ruled by a Roman chosen by the Sabines. After deliberation amongst themselves, they chose Numa Pompilius, a man who was not one of those Sabines who had settled in Rome, but whose excellence was so well known to all that the Sabines, as soon as they heard his name, were even more eager for him than the Romans who had chosen him. When they had informed the people of their decision, they sent an embassy to Numa, composed of the leading men of both parties, to beg of him to come to Rome and assume the crown. Numa belonged to a celebrated Sabine city, Cures, from which the united Romans and Sabines called themselves Quirites. He was the son of Pomponius, an honorable citizen, and was the youngest of 4 brothers. By a miraculous coincidence, he was born on the very day on which Romulus founded Rome, that is, the 10th day before the calends of May. His naturally good disposition had been so educated by sorrow and philosophic pursuits that he rose superior not merely to commonplace vices, but even to the worship of brute force, so common among barbarians, and considered true courage to consist in the conquest of his own passions. Accordingly, he banished all luxury and extravagance from his house, and was known as a trusty friend and counselor, both by his countrymen and by strangers. When at leisure he disregarded sensual enjoyments and money-getting, but devoted himself to the service of the gods and to speculations about their nature and power, so that he obtained great celebrity. Indeed, Tatius, when he was acting as joint king with Romulus, chose him for the husband of his only daughter Tatia. But Numa was not elated by his marriage, and did not remove himself to the town where his father-in-law was king, but stayed where he was in Cures, among the Sabines, tending his aged father, while Tatia also preferred the quiet of a private citizen's life to the pomp which she might have enjoyed in Rome. She is said to have died in the 13th year of her marriage. Now Numa was in the habit of leaving the city and passing much of his time in the country, wandering alone in the sacred groves and dwelling in the desert places. Hence the story first arose that it was not from any derangement of intellect that he shunned human society, but because he held converse with higher beings, and had been admitted to marriage with the gods, and that, by passing his time in converse with the nymph Egeria, who loved him, he became blessed, and learned heavenly wisdom. It is evident that this is the same as many ancient myths, such as that told by the Phrygians about Attis, that of the Bithynians about Herodotus, that of the Arcadians about Endymion, and many others. Yet it seems probable that a god, who loves man better than bird or beast, should take pleasure in conversing with those men who are remarkable for goodness, and not despise nor disdain to hold communion with the wise and righteous. But it is hard to believe that a god or deity could feel the passion of love for a human form, although the Egyptians not unreasonably say that a woman may be impregnated by the spirit of a god, but that a man can have no material union with a god. However, it is very right to believe that a god can feel friendship for a man, and from this may spring a love which watches over him and guides him in the path of virtue. There is truth in the myths of Phorbas, of Hyacinthus, and of Admetus, who were all loved by Apollo, as was also Apollotus of Sicyon. It is said that whenever he set sail from Sicyon to Caere on the opposite coast, the Pythia would recite the verse, "Now goes our dear Hippolytus to sea," as if the god knew that he was coming and rejoiced at it. There is also a legend that Pan loved Pindar and his verses, and for the muse's sake Hesiod and Archilochus were honored after their deaths, while Sophocles during his life is said, by a legend which remains current at the present day, to have become the friend of Aesculapius, and on his death to have had the rites of burial supplied by the care of another god. If, then, we believe the legends which are told about these persons, why should we doubt that Zaleucus, Minos, Zoroaster, Numa, and Lycurgus were inspired by heaven, when they governed their kingdoms and gave them laws? We may suppose that the gods, when in an earnest mood, would hold converse with such men as these, the best of their kind, to talk with and encourage them, just as they visit the poets, if they do at all, when inclined for pleasure. However, if anyone thinks differently, as Bacchylides says, the way is broad. The other view, which some take about Lycurgus and Numa and such men, seems very plausible, that they, having to deal with an obstinate and unmanageable people when introducing great political changes, invented the idea of their own divine mission as a means of safety for themselves. It was in Numa's 40th year that the envoys came from Rome to ask him to be king. Their spokesmen were Proculus and Valesius, one of whom had very nearly been elected king, for the Romulus' people inclined much to Proculus, and those of Tatius were equally in favor of Valesius. These men made a short speech, imagining that Numa would be delighted with his fortune. But it appears that it took much hard pleading to induce a man who had lived all his life in peace to take the command of a city which owed its origin and its increase alike to war. He said in the presence of his father and of Marcius, one of his relations, "Every change in a man's life is dangerous, and when a man is not in want of anything needful, and has no cause for being dissatisfied with his lot, it is sheer madness for him to change his habits and way of life. For these, at any rate, have the advantage of security, while in the new state all is uncertain. Not even uncertain are the perils of royalty, judging from Romulus himself, who was suspected of having plotted against his partner Tatius, and whose peers were suspected of having assassinated him. Yet these men call Romulus the child of the gods, and tell how he had a divinely sent nurse, and was preserved by a miracle while yet a child, while I was born of mortal parents, and brought up by people whom you all know. Even the points which you praise in my character are far from those which make a good king, being love of leisure and of unprofitable speculation, and also a great fondness for peace and unwarlike matters, and for men who meet together for the glory of the gods, or for cheerful converse with one another, and who at other times plough their fields and feed their cattle at home. But you Romans have very likely many wars left upon your hands by Romulus, for the conduct of which the state requires a vigorous warrior in the prime of life. The people, too, from their successes, are accustomed to and eager for war, and are known to be longing for fresh conquests and possessions, so that they would ridicule me when I told them to honor the gods and act justly, and if I tried to instill a hatred of wars and of brute force into a city which wants a general more than a king. As he refused the offered crown in such terms, the Romans used every kind of entreaty to induce him to accept it, begging him not to plunge the state again into civil war, because there was no other man whom the two parties would agree to receive as their king. In their absence, his father and Marcius begged him not to refuse so great and marvelous an offer. If, they said, you do not desire wealth because of your simple life, and do not care for the glory of royalty, because you derive more glory from your own virtue, yet think that to be king is to serve God, who gives you this office, and will not allow your righteousness to lie idle, useful only to yourself. Do not therefore shrink from assuming this office, which gives you an opportunity to conduct the solemn ceremonials of religion with due pomp, and to civilize the people and turn their hearts, which can be effected more easily by a king than by anyone else. This people loved Tatius, though he was a foreigner, and they respect the memory of Romulus as if he was a god. And who knows if the people, although victorious, may not have had enough of wars and sated with triumphs and spoils, may not be desirous of a gentle and just ruler under whom they may enjoy rest and peace. If, however, they are madly bent upon war, is it not better that you should hold the reins and direct their fury elsewhere, becoming yourself a bond of union and friendship between the Sabine nation and this powerful and flourishing city? Besides these arguments, it is said that the omens were favorable, and that the people of the city, as soon as they heard of the embassy, came and besought him to go and become king, and thus unite and combine the two races. When he had made up his mind, he sacrificed to the gods and started for Rome. The Senate and people met him and showed great affection for him. The matrons also greeted him, and there were sacrifices in the temple, and every one was as joyous as if he had received a kingdom instead of a king. When they came into the forum, the interrex, or temporary king, Spurius Vettius, put it to the vote, and all the people voted for Numa. When they offered him the insignia of royalty, he bade them stop, saying that he wished to have his crown confirmed to him by God as well as by man. Taking the prophets and priests, he ascended the Capitol, which the Romans at that time called the Tarpeian Hill. There the chief of the prophets made him turn towards the south, covered his head, and then standing behind him with his hand laid upon his head, he prayed, and looked for a sign or omen sent from the gods in every quarter of the heavens. A strange silence prevailed upon the people in the forum, as they watched him eagerly until a prosperous omen was observed. Then Numa received the royal robes and came down from the hill among the people. They received him with cheers and congratulations, as the most pious of men, and as of beloved of heaven. When he became king, his first act was to disband the bodyguard of 300 men, whom Romulus always had kept about his person, who were called celeres, that is, swift, for Numa would not distrust a loyal people, nor reign over a disloyal one. Next he instituted a third high priest, in addition to the existing priests of Jupiter and Mars, whom, in honor of Romulus, he called the Flamen Quirinalis. The elder priests are called flamens from the skull caps which they wear, and the word is derived from the Greek word for felt, for at that time Greek words were mingled with Latin ones more than now. For instance, the Laina, borne by the priests, is by Juba said to be of the Greek kleina, and the boy, whose parents must both be alive, who is servant to the priest of Jupiter, is called Camillus, just as the Greeks sometimes call Hermes Cadmillus, from his being the servant of the gods. Numa, after confirming his popularity by these measures, proceeded at once to attempt to convert the city from the practice of war and the strong hand to that of right and justice, just as a man tries to soften and mold a mass of iron. The city at that time was indeed what Plato calls inflamed and angry, for it owed its very existence to the reckless daring by which it had thrust aside the most warlike races of the country, and had recruited its strength by many campaigns and ceaseless war, and as carpentry becomes more fixed in its place by blows, so the city seemed to gain fresh power from its dangers. Thinking that it would be a very difficult task to change the habits of this excited and savage people, and to teach them the arts of peace, he looked to the gods for help, and by sacrifices, processions, and choral dances which he himself organized and arranged, he awed, interested, and softened the manners of the Romans, artfully beguiling them out of their warlike ferocity. Sometimes he spoke of supernatural terrors, evil omens, and unpropitious voices, so as to influence them by means of superstition. These measures proved his wisdom, and showed him a true disciple of Pythagoras, for the worship of the gods was an important part of his state policy, as it is of Pythagoras' system of philosophy. His love of outward show and stratagem was also said to be derived from Pythagoras, for the latter tamed an eagle and made it alight upon him, and when walking through the crowd at Olympia, showed his golden thigh, and did all the other surprising devices which made Timon of Phlius write the epigram, Pythagoras by magic arts and mystic talk deludes men's hearts. So did Numa invent the story of his amour with the wood nymph, and his secret converse with her, and of his enjoying the society of the Muses? He referred most of his prophetic utterances to the Muses, and taught the Romans to worship one of them especially, whom he called Tacita, which means silent or dumb. This seems to have been done in imitation of Pythagoras, who especially revered silence. His legislation about images was also connected with the Pythagorean doctrine, which says that first principles cannot be touched or seen, but are invisible spiritual essences. For Numa forbade the Romans to worship any likenesses of men or of beasts. Among them there was no image of a god, either carved or molded in the early times. For 170 years they built temples and placed shrines in them, but made no image of any living thing, considering that it was wrong to make the worse like the better, and that God cannot be comprehended otherwise than by thought. Their sacrifices also were connected with the Pythagorean doctrine. They were for the most part bloodless, and performed with flour, libations of wine, and all the commonest things. But besides these, there are other distinct proofs of the connection of these two men with one another. One of these is that the Romans enrolled Pythagoras as a citizen, as we are told by Epicharmus, the comic poet, in a letter which he wrote to Antenor. He was a son who lived in olden times and underwent the Pythagorean training. Another proof is that of his 4 sons. King Numa named one Mamercus after the son of Pythagoras, from whom sprung the ancient patrician house of Aemilii. This name was originally given him in sport by the king, who used to call him Aemulos or Wily. I myself have heard many Romans narrate that an oracle once bade the Romans establish the wisest and bravest of the Greeks in their own city, and that in consequence of it they set up 2 brazen statues in the forum, one of Alcibiades and one of Pythagoras. But all this can be so easily disputed that it is not worth while to pursue it farther or to put any trust in it. To Numa also is referred the institution of the pontifices, or high priests, and he himself is said to have been one of the first. The Pontifices are so called, according to some authorities, because they worship the gods, who are powerful and almighty, for powerful in Latin is potens. Others say that it refers to an exception made in favor of possibilities, meaning that the legislator ordered the priests to perform what services lay in their power, and did not deny that there are some which they cannot. But the most usually received and most absurd derivation is that the word means nothing more than bridge builders, and that they were so named from the sacrifices which are offered upon the sacred bridge, which are of great sanctity and antiquity. The Latins call a bridge pontem. This bridge is entrusted to the care of the priests, like any other immovable holy relic, for the Romans think that the removal of the wooden bridge would call down the wrath of heaven. It is said to be entirely composed of wood, in accordance with some oracle, without any iron whatsoever. The stone bridge was built many years afterwards, when Aemilius was quaestor. However, it is said that the wooden bridge itself does not date from the time of Numa, but that it was finished by Marcius, the grandson of Numa, when he was king. The chief priest, or Pontifex Maximus, is an interpreter and prophet, or rather expounder of the will of heaven. He not only sees that the public sacrifices are properly conducted, but even watches those who offer private sacrifices, opposes all departure from established custom, and points out to each man how to honor the gods and how to pray to them. He also presides over the holy maidens called Vestals. The consecration of the Vestal Virgins, and the worship and watching of the eternal flame by them, are entirely attributed to Numa, and explained either by the pure and uncorruptible essence of fire being entrusted to the keeping of those who are stainless and undefiled, or by that which is barren and without fruit being associated with maidens. Indeed, in Greece, wherever an eternal fire is kept up, as at Delphi and Athens, it is not maidens, but widows past the age to wed, that tend it. Whenever any of these fires chance to go out, as for instance the sacred lamp went out at Athens when Aristion was despot, and the fire went out at Delphi when the temple was burned by the Persians, and at Rome in the revolutions during the time of the wars with King Mithridates the fire, and even the altar upon which it burned was swept away, then they say that it must not be lighted from another fire, but that an entirely new fire must be made, lighted by a pure and undefiled ray from the sun. They usually light it with mirrors made by hollowing the surface of an isosceles right-angled triangle, which conducts all the rays of light into one point. Now when it is placed opposite to the sun, so that all the rays coming from all quarters are collected together into that point, the ray thus formed passes through the thin air, and at once lights the driest and lightest of the objects against which it strikes, for that ray has the strength and force of fire itself. Some say that the only duty of the Vestal Virgins is to watch that eternal fire, but others say that they perform certain secret rites, about which we have written as much as it is lawful to divulge in the life of Camillus. The first maidens who were consecrated by Numa were named Gagania and Verenia, and afterwards Canulia and Tarpeia were added. Servius subsequently added 2 more to their number, which has remained 6 ever since his reign. Numa ordained that the maidens should observe celibacy for 30 years, during the first 10 years of which they were to learn their duties, during the next perform them, and during the last to teach them. After this period, any of them who wished might marry and cease to be priestesses, but it is said that very few availed themselves of this privilege, and that those few were not happy, but, by their regrets and sorrow for the life they had led, made the others scruple to leave it, prefer to remain virgins till their death. They had great privileges, such as that of disposing of their property by will when their fathers were still alive, like women who have borne 3 children. When they walk abroad, they are escorted by lictors with the fasces, and if they happen to meet any criminal who is being taken to execution, he is not put to death, but the Vestal must swear that she met him accidentally, and not on purpose. When they use a litter, no one may pass under it on pain of death. The Vestals are corrected by stripes for any faults which they commit, sometimes by the Pontifex Maximus, who flogs the culprits without her clothes, but with a curtain drawn before her. She that breaks her vow of celibacy is buried alive at the Colline Gate, at which there is a mound of earth which stretches some way inside the city wall. In it they construct an underground chamber of small size, which is entered from above. In it is a bed with bedding, and a lamp burning, and also some small means of supporting life, such as bread, a little water in a vessel, milk, and oil, as though they wished to avoid the pollution of one who had been consecrated with such holy ceremonies dying of hunger. The guilty one is placed in a litter, covered in and gagged with thongs, so that she cannot utter a sound. Then they carry her through the forum. All make way in silence, and accompany her passage with downcast looks, without speaking. There is no more fearful sight than this, nor any day when the city is plunged into deeper mourning. When the litter reaches the appointed spot, the servants loose her bonds, and the chief priest, after private prayer and lifting his hands to heaven before his dreadful duty, leads her out, closely veiled, places her upon a ladder which leads down into the subterranean chamber. After this he turns away with the other priests. The ladder is drawn up after she has descended, and the site of the chamber is obliterated by masses of earth which are piled upon it, so that the place looks like any other part of the mound. Thus are the Vestals punished who lose their chastity. Numa is said to have built the temple of Vesta, which was to contain the sacred fire, in a circular form, imitating thereby not the shape of the earth, but that of the entire universe, in the midst of which the Pythagoreans placed the element of fire, which they call Vesta and the unit. The earth, they say, is not motionless, and not in the center of its orbit, but revolves around the central fire, occupying by no means the first or the most honorable place in the system of the universe. These ideas are said to have been entertained by Plato also in his old age, for he too thought that the earth was in a subordinate position, and that the center of the universe was occupied by some nobler body. The pontifices also explain, to those who inquire of them, the proper ceremonies at funerals, for Numa taught them not to think that there was any pollution in death, but that we must pay due honors to the gods below, because they will receive all that is noblest on earth. Especially he taught them to honor the goddess Libitina, the goddess who presides over funeral rites, whether she be Proserpine or rather Venus, as the most learned Romans imagine, not unnaturally referring our birth and our death to the same divinity. He also defined the periods of mourning according to the age of the deceased. He allowed none for a child under 3 years of age, and for one older the mourning was only to last as many months as he lived, provided those were not more than 10. The longest mourning was not to continue above 10 months, after which space widows were permitted to marry again, but she that took another husband before that term was obliged by his degree to sacrifice a cow with calf. Of Numa's many other institutions I shall only mention 2, that of the Salii and of the Feciales, which especially show his love of justice. The Feciales are, as it were, guardians of peace, and in my opinion obtained their name from this office. For they were to act as mediators, and not to permit an appeal to arms before all hope of obtaining justice by fair means had been lost. The Greeks call it peace when 2 states settle their differences by negotiation and not by arms, and the Roman Feciales frequently went to states that had done wrong and begged them to think better of what they had done. If they rejected their offer, then the Feciales called the gods to witness, invoked dreadful curses upon themselves and their country, if they were about to fight in an unjust cause, and so declared war. Against the will of the Feciales, or without their approval, no Roman, whether king or common soldier, was allowed to take up arms, but the general was obliged first to have it certified to him by the Feciales that the right was on his side, and then to take his measures for a campaign. It is said that the great disaster with the Gauls befell the city in consequence of this ceremony having been neglected. The barbarians were besieging Clusium. Fabius Ambustus was sent as an ambassador to their camp to make terms on behalf of the besieged. His proposals met with a harsh reply, and he, thinking that his mission was at an end, had the audacity to appear before the ranks of the men of Clusium in arms, and to challenge the bravest of the barbarians to single combat. He won the fight, slew his opponent, and stripped his body, but the Gauls recognized him, and sent a herald to Rome, complaining that Fabius had broken faith and not kept his word, and had waged war against them without it being previously declared. Hereupon the Feciales urged the Senate to deliver the man up to the Gauls, but he appealed to the people, and by their favor escaped his just doom. Soon after the Gauls came and sacked Rome, except for the capital, but this is treated of more at length in the Life of Camillus. The priests called Salii are said to owe their origin to the following circumstances. In the 8th year of Numa's reign, an epidemic raged through Italy and afflicted the city of Rome. Now amidst the general distress, it is related that a brazen shield fell from heaven into the hands of Numa. Upon this the king made an inspired speech, which he had learned from Egeria and the Muses. The shield, he said, came for the salvation of the city, and they must guard it, and make 11 more like it, so that no thief could steal the one that fell from heaven, because he could not tell which it was. Moreover, the place in the meadows round about it, where he was wont to converse with the Muses, must be consecrated to them, and the well by which it was watered must be pointed out as holy water to the Vestal Virgins, that they might daily take some thence to purify and sprinkle their temple. The truth of this is said to have been proved by the immediate cessation of the plague. He bade workmen compete in imitating the shield, and when all others refused to attempt it, Veturius Memurius, one of the best workmen of the time, produced so admirable an imitation, and made all the shields so exactly alike, that even Numa himself could not tell which was the original. He next appointed the Salii to guard and keep them. These priests were called Salii, not, as some say, after a man of Samothrace or of Mantinea named Salius, who first taught the art of dancing under arms, but rather from the springing dance itself, which they dance through the city when they carry out the shields in the month of March, dressed in scarlet tunics, girt with brazen girdles, with brazen helmets on their heads and little daggers with which they strike the shields. The rest of their dance is done with their feet. They move gracefully, whirling round, swiftly and airily counterchanging their positions with light and vigorous motions according to rhythm and measure. The shields are called anchylia because of their shape, for they are not round, nor with a perfect circumference, but are cut out of a wavy line, and curl in the thickest part towards each other. Or they may be called anchylia after the name of the elbow, ankon, on which they are carried. At least so Juba conjectures in his endeavors to find a Greek derivation for the word. The name may be connected with the fall of the shield from above, anakathon, or with the healing achesis of the plague, and the cessation of that terrible calamity, if we must refer the word to a Greek root. It is related that, to reward Memurius for his workmanship, his name is mentioned in the song which the Salii sing while they dance their Pyrrhic dance. Others, however, say that it is not Veturium Memoriam that they say, but Veturium Memoriam, which means ancient memory. After he had arranged all religious ceremonies, he built, near the temple of Vesta, the Regia, as a kind of royal palace, and there he spent most of his time, engaged in religious duties, instructing the priests, or awaiting some divine colloquy. He had also another house on the hill of Quirinus, the site of which is even pointed out now. In all religious processions through the city, the heralds went first to bid the people cease their work and attend to the ceremony. For just as Pythagoreans are said to forbid the worship of the gods in a cursory manner, and to insist that men shall set out from their homes with this purpose and none other in their minds, so Numa thought it wrong that the citizens should see or hear any religious ceremony in a careless, half-hearted manner, and made them cease from all worldly cares and attend with all their hearts to the most important of all duties, religion. So he cleared the streets of all the hammering and cries and noises which attend the practice of ordinary trades and handicrafts before any holy ceremony. Some trace of this custom still survives in the practice of crying out "Hoc age" when the consul is taking the auspices or making a sacrifice. These words mean "do this thing," and are used to make the bystanders orderly and attentive. Many of his other precepts are like those of the Pythagoreans. For, just as they forbid men to sit upon a quart measure, or to stir the fire with a sword, or to turn back when they set out upon a journey, and bid them sacrifice an odd number to the gods above, and an even one to those below, all of which things had a mystical meaning, which was hidden from the common mass of mankind, so also some of Numa's rites can only be explained by reference to some secret legend, such as his forbidding men to make a libation to the gods with wine made from an unpruned vine, and his ordering that no sacrifice should be made without flour, and that men should turn round while worshipping and sit after they had worshipped. The first two of these seem to point to cultivation of the fruits of the earth, as a part of righteousness. The turning round of the worshippers is said to be in imitation of the revolution of the globe, but it seems more probable that, as all temples look towards the east, the worshipper who enters with his back to the sun turns round towards this god also, and begs of them both, as he makes his circuit, to fulfill his prayer. Unless indeed there is an allusion to the symbolic wheel of the Egyptians, and the change of posture means that nothing human is constant, and that, however God may turn about their lives, it is our duty to be content. The act of sitting after prayer was said to pretend that such as these were good would obtain a solid and lasting fulfillment of their prayers. Or again, this attitude of rest marks the division between different periods of prayer, so that after the end of one prayer they seat themselves in the presence of the gods, in order that under their auspices they may begin the next. This fully agrees with what has been said above, and shows that the lawgiver intended to accustom his countrymen not to offer their prayers in a hurry, or in the intervals of doing something else, but when they were at leisure and not pressed for time. By this religious training the city became so easily managed by Numa, and so impressed by his power, as to believe stories of the wildest character about him, and to think nothing incredible or impossible if he wished to do it. For instance, it is related that once he invited many of the citizens to dine with him, and placed before them common vessels and poor fare. But as they were about to begin dinner, he suddenly said that his familiar goddess was about to visit him, and at once displayed abundance of golden cups and tables covered with costly delicacies. The strangest story of all is that of his conversation with Jupiter. The legend runs that Mount Aventine was not at this time enclosed within the city, but was full of fountains and shady glens, and haunted by two divinities, Picus and Faunus, who may be compared to satyrs or to Pan, and who, in knowledge of herbs and magic, seem equal to what the Greeks called the Dactyli of Mount Ida. These creatures roamed about Italy playing their tricks, but Numa caught them by filling the spring at which they drank with wine and honey. They turned into all kinds of shapes, and assumed strange and terrible forms, but when they found that they were unable to escape, they told Numa much of the future, and showed him how to make a charm against thunderbolts, which is used to this day and is made of onions and hair and sprats. Some say that it was not these deities who told him the charm, but that by magic arts brought down by Jupiter from heaven, and he, in a rage, ordered Numa to make the charm of heads, and when Numa added, of onions, he said, of men's hair, said Numa, again taking away the terrible part of the imprecation. When then Jupiter said, with living, sprats, said Numa, answering as Egeria had taught him. The god went away appeased, and the place was in consequence called Elysius. This was how the charm was discovered. These ridiculous legends show the way in which the people had become accustomed to regard the gods. Indeed, Numa is said to have placed all his hopes in religion, to such an extent that even when a message was brought him, saying, "The enemy are approaching," he smiled and said, "And I am sacrificing." The first temples that he founded are said to have been those of Fides, or Faith, and Terminus. Fides is said to have revealed to the Romans the greatest of all oaths, which they even now make use of, while Terminus is the god of boundaries, to whom they sacrifice publicly and also privately at the divisions of men's estates. At the present time with living victims, but in old days this was a bloodless sacrifice, for Numa argued that the god of boundaries must be a lover of peace and a witness of righteousness, and therefore averse to bloodshed. Indeed, Numa was the first king who defined the boundaries of the country, since Romulus was unwilling, by measuring what was really his own, to show how much he had taken from other states. For boundaries, if preserved, are barriers against violence. If disregarded, they become standing proofs of lawless injustice. The city had originally but a small territory of its own, and Romulus gained the greater part of its possessions by the sword. All this Numa distributed among the needy citizens, thereby removing the want which urged them to deeds of violence, and by turning the people's thoughts to husbandry, he made them grow more civilized as their land grew more cultivated. No profession makes men such passionate lovers of peace as that of a man who farms his own land, for he retains enough of the warlike spirit to fight fiercely in defense of his own property, but has lost all desire to despoil and wrong his neighbors. It was for this reason that Numa encouraged agriculture among the Romans, as a spell to charm away war, and loved the art more because of its influence on men's minds than because of the wealth which it produced. He divided the whole country into districts, which he called pagi, and appointed a head man for each, and a patrol to guard it. And sometimes he himself would inspect them, and forming an opinion of each man's character from the condition of his farm, would raise some to honors and offices of trust, and blaming others for their remissness would lead them to do better in future. Of his other political measures, that which is most admired is his division of the populace according to their trades. For whereas the city, as has been said, originally consisted of two races, which stood aloof one from the other and would not combine into one, which led to endless quarrels and rivalries, Numa, reflecting that substances which are hard and difficult to combine together can nevertheless be mixed and formed into one mass if they are broken up into small pieces, because then they more easily fit into each other, determined to divide the whole mass of the people of Rome into many classes, and thus, by creating numerous petty rivalries, to obliterate their original and greatest cause of variance. His division was according to their trades, and consisted of the musicians, the goldsmiths, the builders, the dyers, the shoemakers, the carriers, the coppersmiths, and the potters. All the other trades he united into one guild. He assigned to each trade its special privileges, common to all the members, and arranged that each should have its own times of meeting, and worship its own special patron god. And by this means he did away with that habit, which hitherto had prevailed among the citizens, of some calling themselves Sabines, and some Romans, one boasting that they were Tatius's men, and others Romulus's. So this division procured a complete fusion and unity. Moreover, he has been much praised for another of his measures, that, namely, of correcting the old law which allows fathers to sell their sons for slaves. He abolished this power in the case of married men, who had married with their father's consent, for he thought it a monstrous injustice that a woman who had married a free man should be compelled to be the wife of a slave. He also dealt with astronomical matters, not with perfect accuracy, and yet not altogether without knowledge. During the reign of Romulus, the months had been in a state of great disorder, some not containing 20 days, some 35, some even more, because the Romans could not reconcile the discrepancies which arise from reckoning by the sun and the moon, and only insisted upon one thing, that the year should consist of 360 days. Numa reckoned the variation to consist of 11 days, as the lunar year contained 354 days, and the solar year 365. He doubled these 11 days and introduced them every other year, after February, as an intercalary month, 22 days in duration, which was called by the Romans Mercedinus. This was a remedy for the irregularities of the calendar, which itself required more extensive remedies. He also altered the order of the months, putting March, which used to be the first month, third, and making January the first, which in the time of Romulus had been the 11th, and February the second, which then had been the 12th. There are many writers who say that these months, January and February, were added to the calendar by Numa, and that originally there had only been 10 months in the year, just as some barbarians have 3, and in Greece the Arcadians have 4, and the Acarnanians 6. The Egyptians originally had but 1 month in their year, and afterwards are said to have divided it into 4 months. Wherefore, though they live in the newest of all countries, they appear to be the most ancient of all nations, and in their genealogies reckon an incredible number of years, because they count their months as years. One proof that the Romans used to reckon 10 months and not 12 in the year is the name of the last month, for up to the present day it is called December, the 10th, and the order of the months shows that March was the first. For the 5th month from it they call Quintilis, the 5th, and the 6th month Sextilis, and so on for the others, although by their putting January and February before March, it resulted that the month which they number 5th is really 7th in order. Moreover, there is a legend that the month of March, being the first, was dedicated by Romulus to Mars, and the second April to Aphrodite, in which month they sacrificed to this goddess, and the woman bathed on the first day of it crowned with myrtle. Some, however, say that April is not named after Aphrodite, because the word April does not contain the letter H, and that it comes from the Latin word aperio, and means the month in which the springtime opens the buds of plants, for that is the word signifies. Of the following months, May is named after Maia, the mother of Hermes or Mercury, for it is dedicated to her, and June from Juno. Some say that these names signify old age and youth, for old men are called by the Latins maiores, and young men juniores. The remaining months they named, from the order in which they came, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, Quintilis, Sextilis, September, October, November, December. Then Quintilis was called Julius after Julius Caesar, who conquered Pompeius, and Sextilius was called Augustus, after the second of the Roman emperors. The next 2 months Domitian altered to his own titles, but not for any long time, as after his death they resumed their old names of September and October. The last 2 alone have preserved their original names without change. Of the months added or altered by Numa, Februarius means the month of purification, for that is as nearly as possible the meaning of the word, and during it they sacrifice to the dead, and hold the festival of the Lupercalia, which resembles a ceremony of purification. The first month, Januarius, is named after Janus. My opinion is that Numa moved the month named after Mars from its precedence, wishing the art of good government to be honored before that of war. For Janus, in very ancient times, was either a deity or a king, who established a social polity and made men cease from a savage life like that of wild beasts. And for this reason his statues are made with a double face, because he turned men's way of life from one form to another. There is a temple to him in Rome, which has 2 doors, and which they call the Gate of War. It is the custom to open the temple in time of war, and to close it during peace. This scarcely ever took place, as the empire was almost always at war with some state, being by its very greatness continually brought into collision with the neighboring tribes. Only in the time of Caesar Augustus, after he had conquered Antonius, it was closed, and before that during the consulship of Marcus Atilius and Titus Manlius for a short time, and then was almost immediately reopened as a new war broke out. But during Numa's reign, no one saw it open for a single day, and it remained closed for 43 years continuously, so utterly had he made wars to cease on all sides. Not only was the spirit of the Romans subdued and pacified by the gentle and just character of their king, but even the neighboring cities, as if some soothing, healthful air was breathed over them from Rome, altered their habits, and longed to live quiet and well governed, cultivating the earth, bringing up their families in peace, and worshipping the gods. And gay festivals and entertainments, during which the people of the various states fearlessly mixed with one another, prevailed throughout Italy, for Numa's knowledge of all that was good and noble was shed abroad like water from a fountain, and the atmosphere of holy calm by which he was surrounded spread over all men. The very poets, when they wrote of that peaceful time, were unable to find adequate expressions for it, as one writes, "Across the shields are cobwebs laid, rust eats the lance and keen-edged blade. No more we hear the trumpets bray, and from our eyes no more is slumber chased away." No war, revolution, or political disturbance of any kind is recorded during Numa's reign, neither was there any envy or hatred of him, or any attempt by others to obtain the crown, but either fear of the gods who visibly protected him, or reverence for his virtues, or the special grace of heaven, made men's lives innocent and untainted with evil, and formed a striking proof of the truth of what Plato said many years afterwards, that the only escape from misery for men is when by divine providence philosophy is combined with royal power and used to exalt virtue over vice. Blessed indeed is the truly wise man, and blessed are they who hear the words of his mouth. Indeed, his people require no restraints or punishments, but, seeing a plain example of virtue in the life of their chief, they themselves of their own accord reform their lives, and model them upon that gentle and blessed rule of love and just dealing one with another which is the noblest work of politicians to establish. He is most truly a king who can teach such lessons as these to his subjects, and Numa, beyond all others, seems to have clearly discerned this truth. Historians differ in their accounts of his wives and children. Some say that he married Tatia alone and was the father of one daughter only, namely Pompilia, but others besides her assign to him 4 sons, named Pompo, Pinus, Calpus, and Mamercus, from whom descended the 4 noble families of the Pomponii, Pinarii, Calphurnii, Mamerci, which are for this reason took the title of Rex, that is, king. Others again say that these pedigrees were invented to flatter these families, and state that the Pompilian family descends not from Tatia, but from Lucretia, whom he married after he became king. All, however, agree that Pompilia married Marcius, the son of that Marcius who encouraged Numa to accept the crown. This man accompanied Numa to Rome, was made a member of the Senate, and after Numa's death laid claim to the crown, but was worsted by Tullus Hostilius and made away with himself. His son, Marcius, who married Pompilia, remained in Rome and became the father of Ancus Marcius, who was king after Tullus Hostilius, and who was only 5 years old when Numa died. We are told by Piso that Numa died not by a sudden death, but by slow decay from sheer old age, having lived a little more than 80 years. He was enviable even in death, for all the friendly and allied nations assembled at his funeral with national offerings. The senators bore his bier, which was attended by the chief priests, while the crowd of men, women, and children who were present followed with such weeping and wailing that one would have thought that, instead of an aged king, each man was about to bury his own dearest friend, who had died in the prime of life. At his own wish, it is said, the body was not burned, but placed in 2 stone coffins and buried on the Gianiculum hill. One of these contained his body, and the other the sacred books which he himself had written, as Greek legislators write their laws upon tablets. During his life he had taught the priests the contents of these books and their meaning and spirit, and ordered them to be buried with his corpse, because it was right that holy mysteries should be contained, not in soulless writings, but in the minds of living men. For this same reason they say that Pythagoreans never reduced their maxims to writing, but implanted them in the memories of worthy men, and when some of their difficult processes in geometry were divulged to unworthy men, they said that heaven would mark its sense of the wickedness which they had been committed by some great public calamity, so that, as Numa's system so greatly resembled that of Pythagoras, we can easily pardon those who endeavor to establish a connection between them. Valerius of Antium says that 12 sacred books and 12 books of Greek philosophy were placed in the coffin. 400 years afterward, when Publius Cornelius and Marcus Baebius were consuls, a great fall of rain took place, and the torrent washed away the earth and exposed the coffins. When the lids were removed, one of the coffins was seen by all men to be empty and without any trace of a corpse in it. The other contained the books, which were read by Pompilius the praetor, who reported to the Senate that in his opinion it was not right that their contents should be made known to the people, and they were therefore carried to the Comitium and burned there. All good and just men receive most praise after their death, because their unpopularity dies with them or even before them. But Numa's glory was enhanced by the unhappy reigns of his successors. Of 5 kings who succeeded him, the last was expelled and died in exile, and of the other 4, not one died a natural death, but 3 were murdered by conspirators. And Tullus Hostilius, who was king next after Numa, and who derided and insulted his wise ordinances, especially those connected with religion, as lazy and effeminate, and who urged the people to take up arms, was cut down in the midst of his boastings by a terrible disease, and became subject to superstitious fears in no way resembling Numa's piety. His subjects were led to share these terrors, more especially by the manner of his death, which is said to have been by the stroke of a thunderbolt.